Jake Morrow wiped the grease from his hands with a worn rag, the familiar smell of hydraulic fluid and metal shavings filling his nostrils. The engine bay of the Endeavour hummed with the steady rhythm of the fusion drives, a sound that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over the past 18 months. He ran his fingers along the smooth surface of the primary coolant manifold, checking for the subtle vibrations that might indicate a failing seal. "Everything looks good down here, Captain," Jake called into his comm unit, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped engineering section. Above him, hundreds of cables and conduits snaked through the bulkheads like the nervous system of some vast mechanical organism. Captain Sarah Chen's voice crackled back through the speaker. "Good to hear, Jake. We're still 3 weeks out from Europa, and I'd rather not have any surprises before we establish the colony." Jake smiled to himself. Chen was a good captain, steady, thoughtful, and she actually listened to her crew. Unlike some of the corporate-appointed commanders he'd worked under, she understood that a ship was only as reliable as its weakest component, and in deep space, that could mean the difference between life and death. The Endeavour was humanity's most ambitious colonization vessel, carrying 2,000 souls and enough equipment to establish a permanent settlement on Jupiter's ice-covered moon. For Jake, it represented the culmination of 15 years working on everything from asteroid miners to luxury cruise liners. This mission would set up humanity's first major foothold in the outer solar system, and he was proud to be part of it. He moved to the next inspection point, running his scanner over the backup power couplings. The readings were all green, but Jake had learned long ago not to trust instruments alone. His experienced hands could detect problems that sensors might miss, a loose connection here, a worn bearing there. It was part intuition, part experience, and part stubborn refusal to let machinery get the better of him. "Jake, you down there?" The voice belonged to Maria Santos, his assistant engineer and one of the sharpest technical minds he'd ever worked with. "Always am. What's the situation?" "We've got some anomalous readings from the forward sensor array. Captain wants you to take a look." Jake frowned. The sensor array was critical for navigation, especially as they approached Jupiter's radiation-heavy environment. "On my way." He made his way through the ship's corridors, noting the quiet efficiency of the crew going about their duties. Families with children walked past, some of the kids pressing their faces against the observation ports to catch a glimpse of the stars. These weren't just colonists, they were pioneers, the first humans who would call Europa home. The sensor control room was located near the ship's bow, a compact space filled with displays showing everything from gravitational readings to electromagnetic signatures. Maria was hunched over a console, her dark hair tied back in a practical ponytail. "What are we looking at?" Jake asked, settling beside her. "Started about an hour ago," Maria said, pointing to a series of readings on her screen. "Forward array is picking up intermittent gravitational anomalies. Nothing too dramatic, but definitely not normal space." Jake studied the data. The readings showed subtle fluctuations in the local gravitational field, as if space itself was somehow unstable. "Could be interference from Jupiter's magnetosphere. We're still in its influence zone." "That's what I thought initially, but look at this." Maria brought up a comparison chart. "Jupiter's magnetic field is stable right now. Solar activity is minimal. These readings don't match any known phenomena." Before Jake could respond, the ship's intercom crackled to life. "All hands, this is the bridge. We're detecting a debris field directly ahead. Appears to be natural meteoric material. All non-essential personnel should secure themselves as a precautionary measure." Jake and Maria exchanged looks. Meteor showers weren't uncommon in the outer solar system, but the timing felt ominous given the sensor anomalies. "I'm heading to the bridge," Jake said. "Keep monitoring those readings." The Endeavour's bridge was a study in controlled tension. Captain Chen stood at the center of it all, her eyes fixed on the main display showing the approaching debris field. Navigation Officer Liu was at his station, fingers dancing over controls as he calculated evasive maneuvers. "Talk to me, Jake," Chen said without turning around. "Maria's picking up gravitational anomalies that don't match anything in our databases. The timing with this debris field seems suspicious." Chen nodded grimly. My thoughts exactly. Lu, how bad is it out there? Debris field is approximately 50 kilometers wide, Lu reported. Most objects are small, but I'm reading several massive fragments, some over 100 meters across. At our current velocity, we'll hit the field in approximately 4 minutes. Options? We can alter course, but it'll add 2 weeks to our journey time. Alternatively, we can reduce speed and try to navigate through the thinner sections. Jake watched the tactical display, his engineer's mind already calculating stresses and potential failure points. Captain, with respect, I'd recommend the course change. The ship can handle some debris impacts, but if we hit something significant... His words were cut off by a proximity alarm. The main screen zoomed in on a cluster of objects directly ahead, not small meteors, but jagged chunks of rock and ice, some tumbling end over end with deadly momentum. All hands brace for impact, Chen ordered over the ship-wide comm. Emergency stations, now. Jake grabbed onto the nearest support rail as the ship's defensive systems came online. Point defense lasers began firing, their brilliant beams lancing out to vaporize smaller debris. But there were too many objects, and some were too large for the lasers to destroy completely. The first impact sent a shudder through the ship's hull. Jake felt it in his bones, the groaning protest of metal under stress. Emergency lights flickered on as the main lighting dimmed. Hull breach in Section 7. Came a report from damage control. Sealing now. Another impact, this one stronger. Jake watched the engineering displays as power fluctuations cascaded through the ship's systems. The fusion drives stuttered, their steady hum becoming irregular. We're losing primary power, Jake called out, his fingers already working on his portable diagnostic unit. I need to get to engineering. Negative, Chen snapped. I need you here. Can you reroute around the damaged systems? Jake's mind raced through the ship's electrical schematics. Possibly, but I'll need direct access to the main distribution board. That's 3 decks down. The passage through the wormhole lasted either seconds or eternity, Jake couldn't tell which. Time seemed to stretch and compress around them, and for a moment he thought he could see the entire universe laid out like a vast, interconnected web of light and energy. Then reality reasserted itself with a jarring suddenness that left him gasping. Emergency lighting bathed the bridge in red, and the familiar hum of the ship's systems was noticeably absent. Jake immediately pulled up his diagnostics, his hands moving automatically over the controls even as his mind struggled to process what had just happened. Status report, Chen called out, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Navigation is offline, Lu reported. I'm not reading any familiar stellar markers. We're somewhere else. Engineering status, Jake? Jake's screens painted a grim picture. We've got multiple system failures. Main engines are offline, life support is running on backup power, and I'm showing hull breaches in at least 6 sections. He paused, studying the damage reports. It could have been worse, but we need to prioritize repairs or we won't last long. What's our immediate situation? We're in stable orbit around something, Lu said, his voice filled with confusion. I'm reading a planetary body approximately 2 light minutes away, but the stellar configuration doesn't match anything in our databases. Jake moved to the navigation station and looked at the readings himself. The local star was similar to Earth's sun but noticeably brighter, and the planet they were orbiting appeared to be roughly Earth-size with extensive cloud cover. Captain, Maria's voice came over the comm, excitement barely contained. You need to see these sensor readings. The planet, it's not just habitable. I'm detecting clear signs of an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, extensive water coverage, and... She paused. Life signs. Lots of them. The bridge fell silent. They were supposed to be establishing humanity's first major off-world colony on the lifeless ice of Europa. Instead, they'd been thrown across space to orbit an alien world teeming with life. Recommendations? Chen asked. Jake looked around the bridge at the faces of the crew. These were good people, professionals who dedicated their lives to humanity's expansion into space. But they were also parents, spouses, dreamers who'd signed up for a mission to a known destination, not an alien world in uncharted space. First priority has to be the ship, Jake said. We need life support, engines, and communication systems operational before we can consider anything else. That'll take at least 72 hours if everything goes right. And if we can't repair the ship? Jake met Chen's eyes. Then we need to consider alternatives. Over the next 3 days, Jake barely slept. He led repair teams through the damaged sections of the ship, jury-rigging solutions and cannibalizing non-essential systems to keep the critical ones running. The hull breaches were sealed with emergency patches, but several compartments remained uninhabitable. The worst damage was to the main drive system. A large fragment of debris had punched through the hull and destroyed 2 of the primary fusion reactors. Jake and his team worked around the clock to bring the remaining reactor online, but it would only provide about 60% of their normal power. It's not enough for interstellar travel, Jake explained to Chen during one of their regular briefings. We can maintain life support and basic maneuvering, but if we try to generate enough power for a long-range jump, we'll likely suffer a catastrophic failure. Chen nodded grimly. So we're stuck here. Unless we can find replacement parts or a way to completely rebuild the drive system. Jake gestured to his damage assessment reports. And we don't have the materials for that kind of reconstruction. Meanwhile, the planet below them had become an object of intense fascination for the crew. Maria's sensors revealed a world that seemed almost too good to be true: vast oceans, diverse landmasses, and atmospheric readings that suggested a thriving biosphere. It's like Earth before industrialization, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's chief xenobiologist, reported during a science briefing. The atmospheric composition is nearly identical to Earth's, and I'm detecting complex organic signatures that suggest not just microbial life, but complex ecosystems. Any signs of intelligence? Chen asked. That's harder to determine from orbit, but I'm not seeing any obvious technological signatures. No radio emissions, no large-scale construction, no signs of industrial activity. Vasquez paused. Of course, that doesn't mean there isn't intelligent life down there. They might simply have a different technological development path than humans. Jake listened to the discussion with growing unease. As an engineer, he was trained to think in terms of systems and contingencies. Their current situation had exactly one logical outcome. They would eventually have to go down to the planet. The ship couldn't be fully repaired with available resources, and even if it could, they had no way of knowing how to get home. The decision was made on the 4th day. We're going down, Chen announced during the senior staff meeting. Not permanently, not yet. But we need to assess our options, and that means setting up a preliminary landing team. Captain, Dr. Vasquez interjected. The xenobiological protocols are clear. Contact with an alien biosphere should be approached with extreme caution. We don't know what kind of pathogens or environmental hazards might exist down there. I understand the risks, Doctor. But we also have 2,000 people aboard this ship, and our life support systems are running on borrowed time. We need options. Jake found himself volunteering for the landing team almost before he realized it. You'll need an engineer down there, he said. If we're going to establish any kind of permanent presence, we'll need someone who can adapt our technology to local conditions. Chen studied him for a moment. This isn't going to be a standard engineering assignment, Jake. We're talking about potential first contact with an alien world. I know. But machinery is machinery, and if we're going to survive down there, we'll need someone who can keep it running. The landing team was assembled over the next day, Jake as the engineer, Dr. Vasquez as the biologist, Commander Torres from security, and Dr. Kim, a geologist who could assess the planet's mineral resources. Captain Chen would remain aboard the Endeavour to coordinate rescue operations if needed. As Jake prepared for the mission, he found himself thinking about the families aboard the ship. Children who'd grown up during the long journey to Europa, looking forward to their new home on Jupiter's moon. Parents who'd sacrificed everything for the chance to give their kids a better life among the stars. Now they were all refugees, dependent on the success of this small landing team to determine their fate. The shuttle Magellan detached from the Endeavour with a subtle vibration that Jake felt through his crash couch. Through the small viewport beside him, he watched the mothership slowly recede as they fell toward the planet below. The Endeavour looked smaller than he'd expected, its hull scarred by the debris impacts, but still holding together. "Beginning atmospheric entry in 60 seconds, announced Lieutenant Commander Torres from the pilot's seat. Rosa Torres was career military, with the kind of calm competence that came from years of dangerous missions. If anyone could get them down safely, it would be her. Jake checked his instruments one more time. The shuttle systems were all functioning normally, which was more than he could say for the Endeavour. At least they'd have reliable transportation back to orbit, assuming everything went according to plan. "Entry burn in 10 seconds, Torres called out. "Everyone secure?" The shuttle's engines fired, and Jake felt himself pressed back into his seat as they began their controlled fall toward the alien world. Through his viewport, he watched the planet's atmosphere begin to glow around them, a brilliant aurora of superheated gases marking their passage. Dr. Vasquez was monitoring her biological sensors, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her displays. "Atmospheric composition is holding steady," she reported. "Oxygen at 21%, nitrogen at 77%, trace gases within acceptable parameters." "Any sign of hostile biological agents?" Torres asked. "Nothing obvious, but we won't know for sure until we're on the ground and can run detailed analyses." Jake watched the planet's surface resolve through the atmospheric haze. Vast blue oceans stretched to the horizon, broken by land masses that looked almost Earth-like in their diversity. He could see mountain ranges, river systems, and what appeared to be extensive forests covering much of the visible terrain. "There," Dr. Kim called out, pointing toward a large continent. "That plateau region looks geologically stable. And I'm reading mineral signatures that suggest significant metal deposits." Torres adjusted their trajectory slightly. "Looks good. Nice and flat, away from any obvious population centers." "Population centers?" Jake asked. Kim nodded toward her geological scanner. "I'm seeing regular patterns in some of the river valleys. Could be natural, but they look almost like irrigation systems or planned settlements." Jake felt his stomach tighten. The possibility of intelligent life on the planet was one thing in the abstract, but the reality of it was something else entirely. Humanity's first contact with alien intelligence wouldn't be some grand diplomatic meeting at the United Nations. It would be 4 scared humans in a damaged shuttle, desperately looking for a way to save their ship. 30,000 feet and descending," Torres reported. "Switching to atmospheric flight mode." The shuttle's engines shifted configuration, adapting from rocket thrust to more efficient atmospheric propulsion. Through the viewports, Jake could see individual trees now, and the landscape was becoming startlingly beautiful. Rolling hills covered in something that looked like forest, rivers that sparkled in the sunlight, and skies that were the deep blue of Earth's atmosphere. "It's gorgeous," Dr. Vasquez whispered. "And potentially deadly," Torres reminded them. "Pretty planets can kill you just as dead as ugly ones." At 10,000 feet, Jake began to make out more details of the surface. The forests were indeed covered with what appeared to be vegetation, but the color was slightly wrong, more blue-green than the greens of Earth. And there were structures down there, definitely artificial, scattered across the landscape in patterns that suggested intelligence and planning. "I'm seeing definite signs of construction," he reported. "Regular patterns, cleared areas, what might be roads or pathways." "Any sign of technology?" Torres asked. Jake studied the structures more carefully. They were built from what appeared to be stone or some similar material, with architectural styles that seemed to emphasize curves and flowing lines rather than the angular constructions humans typically favored. But he saw no signs of industrial activity, no smokestacks or power lines or any of the other markers of technological civilization. "Nothing obvious. The architecture suggests intelligence, but the technology level might be pre-industrial. Or post-industrial," Dr. Vasquez suggested. "A species that developed along different technological lines than humans might not have the same industrial signatures we'd recognize." At 5,000 feet, Torres began their final approach to the plateau Dr. Kim had identified. It was a relatively flat area several kilometers across, covered with low vegetation and bordered by what appeared to be a river system. More importantly, it was far enough from any obvious settlements to minimize the risk of immediate contact. 1,000 feet, Torres called out. Beginning final descent. Jake watched the ground rush up toward them as Torres expertly brought the shuttle down. The landing was surprisingly gentle, barely more than a soft bump as the landing struts made contact with alien soil. "We're down," Torres announced. "All systems nominal." For a moment, nobody moved. They were the first humans to set foot on an alien world, if you didn't count the lifeless rocks of the solar system. Jake found himself holding his breath, as if the mere act of breathing might somehow contaminate this pristine world. "Environmental readings?" Torres asked. Dr. Vasquez checked her instruments. "Atmosphere is breathable, but I strongly recommend we maintain containment protocols until we can run full biological analyses. Temperature is 22 degrees Celsius, humidity at 60%, atmospheric pressure slightly lower than Earth normal but well within human tolerance. Any immediate threats? Nothing on sensors, but that doesn't mean much. We'll need to do ground surveys to identify potential hazards." Torres began the shutdown sequence for the shuttle systems, leaving only the essential life support and communication equipment online. "All right, people. This is a preliminary survey only. We gather data, assess resources, and get back to the ship. Nobody takes any unnecessary risks." Jake was the first to cycle through the airlock, his environmental suit bulky but reassuring around him. The suit's systems hummed quietly, filtering the alien air and monitoring for potential threats. He stepped out onto the surface of an alien world and felt the crunch of unfamiliar soil beneath his boots. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth's, giving his movements a subtle bounce that felt almost euphoric. The sky overhead was a brilliant blue, painted with clouds that looked remarkably Earth-like. A gentle breeze rustled the blue-green vegetation around them, and Jake could hear what sounded like bird calls in the distance. "It's beautiful," Dr. Vasquez said over the comm, her voice filled with wonder. Jake had to agree. The landscape stretched out before them like something from a dream, rolling hills covered in vegetation that swayed in the breeze, a river sparkling in the sunlight about a kilometer away, and mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. But it was the silence that struck him most. No traffic noise, no industrial sounds, no human activity at all. Just the whisper of wind and the distant calls of alien wildlife. "Let's set up a preliminary base camp," Torres said, her military training keeping her focused on the mission. "Dr. Kim, I want you to start geological surveys. Dr. Vasquez, begin biological sampling but maintain strict containment protocols. Jake, I need you to assess the area for potential resource extraction and engineering challenges." Jake nodded and began walking the perimeter of their landing site, his instruments scanning for useful materials. The soil was rich and dark, similar to Earth loam but with mineral traces that suggested interesting possibilities. There were what appeared to be metallic deposits scattered throughout the area, and the nearby river would provide both water and potential hydroelectric power. "This could work," he said into his comm. "The geological conditions are excellent for construction, and there are plenty of resources for basic manufacturing." "Define basic," Torres replied. Jake knelt down and scooped up a handful of soil, examining it through his suit's sensors. "I could probably build simple tools, maybe basic electronics if we can locate the right mineral deposits. Nothing as sophisticated as our current technology, but enough to support a small settlement." "Settlement?" Dr. Vasquez's voice carried a note of concern. "Are we seriously considering abandoning the ship?" "We're considering options," Torres said firmly. "That's why we're here." Jake stood and looked back toward the shuttle, its sleek lines contrasting sharply with the organic curves of the alien landscape. The Endeavor was invisible from here, hidden somewhere in the blue sky above, but he could feel its presence like a weight on his shoulders. 2,000 people depending on their small team to find answers. As he continued his survey, Jake began to notice details that his initial observations had missed. The vegetation wasn't just blue-green, it had an almost metallic quality in places, as if the plants incorporated metallic compounds into their structure. Some of the rock formations showed signs of artificial modification, with surfaces that were too smooth and regular to be natural. "Hey!" he called to the others. "You need to see this." The team gathered around a large boulder that Jake had been examining. At first glance it looked like natural stone, but closer inspection revealed intricate patterns carved into its surface, geometric designs that were clearly artificial but unlike any human artistic tradition. "Definitely intelligent work," Dr. Vasquez confirmed, running her scanner over the carvings. "These patterns are too complex and regular to be natural erosion." "How old?" Torres asked. Dr. Kim examined the stone's composition. "Hard to say without more detailed analysis, but based on the weathering patterns, I'd estimate at least several centuries. Possibly much older." Jake traced one of the carved lines with his gloved finger. The pattern seemed to flow like water, curving and spiraling in ways that were pleasing to the eye but completely unlike human geometric traditions. There was something almost hypnotic about it, as if the design was meant to draw the viewer's attention and hold it. "There are more over here," Dr. Vasquez called from across the clearing. "Lots more." Jake looked around with new eyes and realized that what he'd taken for natural rock formations were actually carved monuments scattered throughout the area. Some were simple geometric patterns, others showed what might be abstract representations of living creatures, and a few depicted scenes that could be historical events or religious ceremonies. "We're in the middle of some kind of sacred site," he said. "Or maybe a museum. Which means this area is probably significant to whoever lives here," Torres pointed out. "We might want to consider relocating." Before anyone could respond, Dr. Vasquez's biological sensors began alarming. "Contact," she said sharply. "Multiple life forms approaching from the east." Jake spun around and saw them, figures moving through the vegetation at the edge of the clearing. At first they looked almost human, walking upright on two legs and moving with obvious intelligence and purpose. But as they came closer, the differences became apparent. They were taller than humans, with elongated limbs and a graceful way of moving that suggested lighter bone structure. Their skin had a subtle blue-green tint that matched the local vegetation, and their faces were angular with large, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around them. "Nobody make any sudden moves," Torres said quietly. "Weapons stay holstered unless they show clear hostile intent." There were 6 of them, Jake counted, moving in what appeared to be a loose formation. They carried what might be tools or weapons, long, curved objects that could be staffs or some kind of advanced technology. It was impossible to tell. The aliens stopped about 50 meters away and stood perfectly still, observing the humans with obvious curiosity. Jake found himself staring into those large, dark eyes and wondering what they were thinking. Did they see the humans as invaders? Curiosities? Threats? One of the aliens stepped forward, apparently the leader. It raised one long-fingered hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. When it spoke, the words were completely unintelligible, flowing sounds that seemed to ripple like water. "Universal Translator isn't picking up anything," Torres said. "The language structure is completely outside our databases." Jake watched the alien leader and made a decision that would probably get him reprimanded later. He stepped forward, mimicking the alien's gesture of raising his hand. Then he pointed to himself and said clearly, "Jake." The alien tilted its head, a remarkably human gesture, and repeated the sound. "Jake." Its pronunciation was slightly off, but clearly recognizable. Then it pointed to itself and said something that sounded like flowing water over stones. Jake tried to repeat it, and failed miserably, producing only a rough approximation that made the alien's large eyes seem to sparkle with what might have been amusement. "Well," Dr. Vasquez said quietly, "First Contact Protocol says we should establish peaceful intentions and attempt basic communication." "I think we just did," Jake replied, still looking into those alien eyes. "Now what?" The alien leader made a series of gestures, pointing to the carved stones scattered around the clearing and then to Jake and his team. The meaning seemed clear: these monuments were important, and the humans were trespassing. Jake looked back at Torres, who nodded slightly. They needed to show respect for local customs if they had any hope of establishing peaceful relations. "We're sorry," Jake said, knowing the alien couldn't understand the words but hoping his tone would convey the meaning. He gestured to his team and then toward the shuttle, indicating they were willing to leave. The alien leader made a different gesture, a flowing motion with both hands that somehow conveyed the concept of wait or stay. Then it turned to its companions and spoke in their musical language, the words rising and falling like a complex melody. "They're debating something," Dr. Vasquez observed. "Body language suggests disagreement within the group." Jake watched the aliens' discussion with fascination. Their communication wasn't just verbal. They used subtle changes in posture, gestures, and even what appeared to be bioluminescent patterns on their skin to convey meaning. It was like watching a conversation conducted in light and sound and movement all at once. Finally, the leader turned back to the humans and made a complex gesture that Jake interpreted as an invitation. It pointed toward the river, then to the humans, then made a walking motion with its fingers. "I think they want us to follow them," Jake said. "Bad idea," Torres replied immediately. "We don't know their intentions, and we can't communicate effectively. This could be a trap. Or it could be our only chance to establish peaceful relations," Dr. Vasquez pointed out. "From their perspective, we're the aliens who just landed on their world. The fact that they're attempting communication instead of attacking us is encouraging." Jake studied the alien leader's face, trying to read emotions and features that had evolved on a completely different world. But there was something in those large, dark eyes that seemed genuinely curious rather than hostile. 5 minutes, he said to Torres. "We follow them to see what they want to show us, but we stay close to the shuttle and maintain communication with the ship." Torres clearly didn't like it, but she nodded. 5 minutes. And at the first sign of trouble, we're out of here." The aliens led them toward the river through vegetation that Jake was beginning to recognize as cultivated rather than wild. The plants grew in regular patterns, and there were signs of irrigation and careful tending. This wasn't wilderness, it was farmland. As they crested a small hill, Jake got his first clear view of the alien settlement, and it took his breath away. The buildings seemed to grow out of the landscape itself, their flowing curves and organic shapes blending seamlessly with the natural terrain. They were constructed from what appeared to be a mixture of stone and some kind of bioengineered material that pulsed with soft, bioluminescent patterns. Towers spiraled up toward the sky like massive trees, connected by graceful bridges that arced through the air with impossible elegance. "It's beautiful," Dr. Vasquez whispered. Jake had to agree. The settlement was like nothing in human architecture, completely integrated with the natural environment, while still being obviously artificial. It was as if the aliens had convinced the planet itself to help them build their city. But what struck him most was the technology level. He could see evidence of advanced engineering in the structure's impossible curves and the bioluminescent communication systems that pulsed along the building's surfaces. This wasn't a pre-industrial society. It was something else entirely, a technological path that humans had never considered. "Population estimate?" Torres asked. Jake scanned the settlement, counting structures and estimating capacity. "Maybe 1,000 individuals, possibly more. This is a significant population center." More aliens were emerging from the buildings now, drawn by curiosity about the strange visitors. They maintained a respectful distance but watched the humans with obvious interest. Jake noticed that their clothing seemed to be made from the same bioengineered materials as their buildings, with patterns and colors that shifted in response to their movements. The leader guided them to what appeared to be a central plaza, where a large group of aliens had gathered. Among them was an individual that Jake immediately recognized as elderly. Its movements were slower, more deliberate, and its skin had a silvery quality that suggested great age. The elder alien approached and examined the humans with obvious intelligence. When it spoke, its voice had the quality of wind through leaves, softer than the leader's but somehow carrying more authority. "Dr. Vasquez?" Jake said quietly. Are you getting any of this on your linguistic analysis systems? Recording everything, but the language structure is completely alien. No cognates with any human language family, and the grammar seems to be based on tonal and positional relationships that our systems weren't designed to handle. The elder alien seemed to reach some kind of decision. It gestured to the humans, and then made a series of movements that Jake interpreted as an invitation to sit. There were what appeared to be grown furniture, living wood that had been shaped into comfortable seats. As they sat, Jake noticed that more aliens were gathering around the plaza. But there was no sense of threat or hostility. If anything, the atmosphere reminded him of a town meeting or academic conference. These beings were curious about their visitors and wanted to learn more about them. The elder alien began what was clearly a formal presentation. It gestured to the buildings around them, to the sky, and to various carved stones that Jake was beginning to recognize as historical markers. The meaning was unclear, but the intent seemed to be an explanation of their civilization. I think it's giving us a history lesson, Dr. Vasquez said. As the presentation continued, Jake began to pick up recurring themes. The alien frequently gestured toward the sky, and several times it made movements that suggested traveling or journeying. There were references to what might be other settlements, or even other worlds. Commander Torres, Dr. Kim said quietly, I'm picking up some interesting readings from my geological scanner. The materials these buildings are made from, they're not entirely natural. There are metallic compounds integrated into the organic matrix that suggest very sophisticated material science. Jake studied the buildings with new interest. If these aliens had advanced materials technology, they might be able to help repair the Endeavor. It was a long shot, but right now it was the only hope they had. The elder alien seemed to notice Jake's attention to the buildings. It stood and gestured for the humans to follow, leading them toward one of the spiraling towers. As they walked, Jake noticed that the bioluminescent patterns in the building's surfaces changed in response to their approach, as if the structures themselves were aware of their presence. Inside the tower, Jake's instruments went crazy. The walls were lined with what could only be described as biological computers, living systems that processed information using principles he couldn't even begin to understand. Patterns of light flowed through organic conduits, and the air hummed with barely audible harmonies that suggested massive computational power. This is incredible, Dr. Vasquez breathed. They've integrated biological and technological systems in ways we never considered possible. The elder alien led them to what appeared to be a central console, where patterns of light swirled in three-dimensional displays. It made a series of gestures, and the display changed to show what Jake recognized as a star map. The alien pointed to one star system, then gestured to the humans. The meaning was clear: this is where you came from. Then it pointed to their current location and made a questioning gesture. Jake understood. They wanted to know how the humans had traveled between star systems. He thought for a moment, then pointed to the sky and made a twisting motion with his hands, trying to convey the concept of the wormhole. The elder alien's large eyes widened noticeably. It turned to the other aliens and spoke rapidly in their flowing language, its tone suggesting excitement or alarm. The others responded with obvious agitation, their bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly. I think I just told them something significant, Jake said. But I'm not sure what. The elder alien turned back to the display and manipulated the controls. The star map zoomed out, showing a vast region of space with interconnected lines between star systems. Jake realized he was looking at a map of wormhole networks, and there were dozens of them. They know about the wormholes, Dr. Vasquez said in amazement. This isn't their first contact with space travel. The alien pointed to several of the network connections, making gestures that Jake interpreted as warnings. Some of the wormholes were marked with symbols that clearly indicated danger. Commander, Jake said to Torres, I think they're trying to tell us that we're not the first travelers to come through the wormhole network. And some of those other travelers weren't friendly. Torres's expression was grim. Which means we need to get back to the ship and report this. The Endeavor could be sitting in the middle of a major interstellar shipping lane, and we don't know who else might come through. The elder alien seemed to understand their concern. It made a series of gestures toward the sky, then toward the humans, and finally a protective motion with both arms. The meaning was unmistakable: you are in danger, but we will help. Jake felt a surge of hope. If these aliens were willing to help, they might have the technology needed to repair the Endeavour or at least provide shelter for the colonists until a solution could be found. But first, they needed to get back to the ship and report their findings. Captain Chu needed to know that they weren't alone in this region of space, and that there were other intelligences with knowledge of the wormhole networks. Jake stood and gestured toward the shuttle, then to the sky where the Endeavour waited in orbit. The elder alien nodded, another remarkably human gesture, and made what appeared to be an agreement or promise. As they prepared to leave, the alien leader from their first contact approached with what appeared to be a gift. It was a small device made from the same bioengineered materials as their buildings, covered in flowing patterns that pulsed with soft light. Jake accepted the device and immediately felt it respond to his touch. The pattern shifted and changed, and suddenly he could feel a connection forming in his mind, not telepathy exactly, but a kind of enhanced empathy that let him sense the alien's emotional state. Curiosity, concern, hope, and underneath it all, a deep sadness that spoke of losses and dangers Jake couldn't yet understand. The device was a communicator, he realized. A way to maintain contact across the language barrier. "Thank you," he said, and felt the alien's satisfaction at being understood. As they walked back toward the shuttle, Jake's mind was racing with possibilities. These aliens had technology that could potentially solve their problems, but they also knew about dangers that the humans hadn't even considered yet. The real question was whether they could find a way to work together before those dangers caught up with them.